Wyoming Territory. Autumn of 1877. The wind carried dust and sorrow across the dry hills near Buffalo, and a man with half his face scarred by fire rode alone through the dying light. Malden O'Dale's ranch sat quiet behind him. No cattle in sight. The barn stood half collapsed after a storm last spring, and the house leaned like it had given up. But Malden didn't care much about broken things. He was one too. He had lived alone for 7 years, ever since the fire took his brother's family and left him with skin twisted across his jaw and neck. Folks in town stopped looking him in the eye. Some whispered about curses. Others just stared. He had gotten used to silence, to staring at his hands instead of faces. Today, he was riding to the edge of his land, where the hills met the forest. A neighbor had said something strange, a wagon half sunk in the gully. A woman tied to its wheel. Malden figured it was a mistake. No one came this way unless they were running from something. He found the wagon just before sundown. It had tipped on its side, one wheel shattered. A broken crate of flour spilled into the brush. The woman was still there, ankles bound, wrists rubbed raw. Her dress was torn, but her posture was upright. Her eyes met his without flinching. "I am not begging," she said. Malden dismounted slowly. "I did not say you were." She watched him as he pulled his knife and cut her loose. Her hands trembled, but she held them to her chest like she was protecting something more than skin. "Name's Malden O'Dale," he said, stepping back to give her a moment. "Liora Breck," she said, voice cracking on her last name like she hated the sound of it. "They left me here." "Who?" "My husband's brothers." She spat the word like it burned her tongue. "He died 2 days ago. They buried him and said I was cursed. Said I shamed their name and should rot with the wagon." Malden looked at her bare feet, the bruises on her arms. "You hurt anywhere else?" "No," she said. "Just angry." He offered his canteen. She drank, then choked, then drank again. "They took the horses," she said. "Left me with nothing." "You are not nothing," Malden said, his voice steadier than he felt. She looked at him then, not at the scar, not at his worn shirt or the way his hat shaded half his face. She looked at him like she saw something worth knowing. "You have a place?" she asked. He hesitated. "I have land. House is standing. Stove works." "I will work for food and shelter," she said. "I am not afraid of dirt or sweat." He nodded, because there was something in her eyes. He could not look away from something fierce and shining. "I will take you back," he said. "You will be safe there." They rode double on his horse, her arms around his waist, her silence heavy but not cold. Back at the ranch, he gave her the room upstairs, the one with the faded yellow quilt and the cracked window pane. She touched the windowsill like it was made of gold. "You live alone?" she asked.
I do.
"By choice. By loss." She did not press. That night, Malden cooked beans and cornbread. She ate like someone who had not tasted kindness in a long time. They did not speak much, but when she said goodnight, her voice was soft. The next morning, she was already outside, sleeves rolled, hauling water from the well. "You do not have to work," he said. "I do not know how to be still," she answered. That week, she patched the barn roof with him. She mended his torn shirts. She asked about the cattle, about the land. She never flinched when he turned his head, and the fire scar showed. One night, rain tapped the roof while they sat by the fire. She was sewing. He was whittling. "You do not talk much," she said. "I forgot how," he said. She looked up. "Then I will teach you again." He met her eyes. They gleamed like starlight on a river. "You are not what they said you were," he said. "And you are not broken," she said. Something shifted between them, not loud, not sudden, just warm. The next day, he found her in the barn, crying into her apron. He stepped back, but she saw him. "They killed my hope," she whispered. "I do not want to be alone." He stepped forward. "You're not." She reached for his hand, and he let her hold it. That night, she told him everything. How she married young to escape a cruel father. How her husband had been kind, but weak. How his kin blamed her for his sickness. How they said she was cursed. "I am not a curse," she said. "I am a woman who wants to live." He touched her cheek, careful. "Then live here. With me. I have nothing to offer. You have fire in your eyes, Liora. That is more than anyone ever gave me." She leaned her forehead against his chest. He had not been held in years. He stayed still, afraid to break the moment. The days grew cooler. She planted winter squash. He fixed the porch rail. At night, they sat closer by the fire. He told her stories of his brother's boys, long gone. She listened like their ghosts mattered. Then one morning, she brought him coffee and said, "I want to stay. Not just for shelter. For you." He could not speak. He just took her hand and held it to his chest. "I see you," she said, looking straight into his scarred face. "I see what you are." That night, they kissed for the first time. Gentle. Real. Outside, the wind howled. But inside, everything was quiet and warm. And Malden O'Dale, the scarred rancher who thought he would die alone, felt something new settle in his bones' hope. The first frost came quiet, laying silver on the fence rails and catching in the hollows of hoofprints near the paddock. Malden stood with his gloves tucked into his belt, watching Liora rake ash from the stove with a practiced hand. She'd found her rhythm in the house without asking permission, and each day her presence settled deeper into the floorboards and corners like she'd always been meant to be there. She didn't notice him looking until she straightened and brushed her hands clean on her apron. "You ever think of putting in a smokehouse?" she asked, nodding toward the lean to where he kept the salted pork. "Haven't had enough stock to make it worth it," he said. "Why?" "If you'd let me help cure some meat, we could trade with the mercantile. I've done it before." "Not many women know how," he said, surprised. "My mother taught me before I was old enough to reach the hooks." He nodded, folding that truth into the quiet file he kept of her, one that grew heavier by the day. By mid-morning, they'd set to work on the fence near the south line, where winter winds would catch first. He handed her nails and held the rails steady while she hammered. She didn't shy from splinters, and when her hand slipped and blood welled beneath her thumb, she bit the inside of her cheek and kept going. "You're doing more than I ever expected," he said after a while, wiping sweat from his brow. "I only ever wanted to be needed," she said, not looking up. He leaned on the post beside her. "You think I took you in for pity?" "I think you might have at first." "I didn't," he said, voice low but sure. "I saw someone who'd already stood through worse than most men I've known." She set the hammer down and looked at him, eyes not hard, but clear. "You've got a way of saying things that make it hard to look away," she said. "You've got a way of being that makes it easy to speak them." She didn't smile, just lifted the hem of her sleeve and tied it tighter at the elbow, like she had something building in her she wasn't ready to say yet. Late that afternoon, they rode into town on his wagon. Supplies were low, and she insisted on coming. Malden tried to brace himself against the looks, but they never came. Maybe it was the way Liora walked beside him, chin high, or the way she met every gaze with something that didn't blink. Inside the mercantile, she bartered 2 jars of pickled beans she'd packed from the garden rows he'd forgotten were still good. She spoke with the shopkeep like they were equals, and Malden watched the man nod like he didn't dare think otherwise. On the way back, she held the reins while he sat beside her, arms folded across his chest. "You're quiet," she said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "I never knew someone could make this place feel full without changing a thing." The reins slackened in her hands. The horse slowed on instinct. "You think I belong here?" she asked. "I don't think," he said. "I know." That night, she laid out a tin of acorn biscuits she'd baked and handed him one without a word. He took it, broke off a piece, and held it between his fingers longer than he should have. "You know what I miss?" she said after a long stretch of silence. "What's that?" "Being seen without being measured." He nodded. "That's a hard thing to come by." She looked toward the window, where the moon hung low, brushing light across the sill. "You ever wonder if some people are just born outside the circle?" she asked. "I used to. But then you came along and stood next to me like I wasn't." She said nothing after that. Just reached across the table and touched his wrist once, fingers warm from the oven. The next morning, he heard her humming in the barn. A tune he didn't recognize, slow and minor, like it had been stitched together from memory. When he came in, she was brushing down the mule, her braid tucked into the collar of his old coat. "You don't have to wear that," he said. "It's warm," she answered, not turning. "I could fix up one of my brothers for you. It's finer. I like this one. Smells like cedar and smoke." He stepped closer, hesitated, then took the brush from her hand. "Let me," he said. She didn't argue, just stepped aside and watched him work in silence. After a few minutes, she leaned against the stall, arms crossed. "Why did you never marry?" she asked, voice soft. "I was waiting to feel like I was worth keeping," he answered. She watched him finish the flank, then took the brush back and ran it once down the mule's spine. "You are," she said. "You just needed someone to tell you plain." He didn't speak again until supper, when he poured her a second cup of coffee and said, "You think this could become something lasting?" She looked at him over the rim, eyes steady. "I think it already has." The wind that came down from the bighorns carried the scent of pine and distant snow. Malden watched Liora from the edge of the corral where she was tying back her hair with a strip of muslin, sleeves already rolled up past her elbows. She had asked for nothing that morning, just pulled on her boots and walked out to the pens like she knew exactly what needed doing. He waited until she finished checking the latch on the far gate before he spoke. "Been thinking about building a root cellar. Ground's still soft enough to dig if we start today." She turned, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You planning to store more than potatoes?" "Maybe apples if we can get a trade worked out with the Browders. They've got trees up near Clear Creek." She nodded once. "You dig, I'll line the walls." They worked south of the kitchen window, where the sun hit longest in winter. Malden handled the spade, Liora the wheelbarrow. Neither said much between the shoveling and hauling, but when he paused to rest his back, she handed him a flat stone she'd pulled from the earth. "Found it deep down," she said. "Looks like it might have been shaped." He ran his fingers over the edge, worn smooth. "Could have been used for grinding. This land's older than our boots." She crouched beside him, resting her forearms on her knees. "I used to think places held memory. That you could feel what happened before if you were quiet long enough. You still believe that?" "I think I do." He didn't answer, just turned the stone in his palm until the light caught a faint groove. That night, she brought in a bundle of dried sage she'd gathered near the ridge and set it on the mantel to dry. Malden watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, thumb brushing the seam of his shirt. "I never asked what you want from the days ahead," he said. "You mean past winter?" "I mean for your life. What you'd build if you could." She turned, lifting her chin slightly. "A place with walls that remember laughter. A table set for more than one. Maybe a child, someday, who grows up knowing their mother wasn't something to be thrown away." He stepped forward slowly, closing the space between them. "You'd raise them here?" "If the man beside me wanted the same." He searched her face. "I never thought that kind of future fit my hands." She reached out, took his calloused fingers in hers. "You carry more than sadness. I see how you care for things. The way you watch the land before the frost hits, how you measure the feed, so none goes to waste. That's a kind of love." He looked down at their hands. "You see all that? I see everything you try to hide." The next morning, the root cellar wall was half set before breakfast. She brought him coffee in a chipped enamel cup, then sat beside him in the dirt without a word. Their silence didn't stretch with discomfort. It rested there, soft as cotton batting. Around midday, a rider came up the lane. Sheriff's badge on his vest, hat low, eyes sharp. Malden wiped his hands and stepped forward. "Marshall's telegram came through," the sheriff said. "Word is, Breck's brothers fled into Montana Territory. You'll likely not see them again, but I figured the lady deserved to know." Malden looked back toward the barn. Liora stood in the open door, arms still, face unreadable. "She's not afraid," he said, "but I'll tell her." The sheriff tipped his hat and rode off without another word. Later, Liora sat on the porch steps, her hands folded in her lap. Malden knelt beside her and told her plain. "They're gone north." She let out a long breath, eyes on the cottonwood leaves trembling in the wind. "I thought I'd feel something sharper," she said. "But it's just quiet. Maybe that's what peace sounds like." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "You think there's room for that here? With us?" He reached out, brushing his thumb lightly against the curve of her cheek. "I built this whole place on empty. You filled it without trying." She leaned into his touch, closed her eyes. "Then let's build something that lasts." "I want that. With you." She opened her eyes and held his gaze. "Then say it, Malden. Not as promise. As truth." He didn't hesitate. "I love you, Liora. Not because you saved something in me, but because you saw it was there in the first place." Her smile came slow, steady, the kind that settled deep. "I love you too," she said. "And I'm staying." They didn't kiss then. Not yet. Just sat close as the wind softened and the sun dipped behind the hills, and the world around them came to rest in a way it never had before. By late November, the mornings came with a crust of ice on the water buckets, and the sun didn't rise until the coffee had already been poured. Malden woke before first light, as he always had, but now there were 2 mugs on the table and a second pair of boots by the door, their toes turned slightly inward from where Liora always left them. She was in the yard when he stepped out, a wool shawl draped over her shoulders, her breath curling white in the air. She had a small sack of grain in one hand and was scattering it along the chicken run with slow, even passes. He moved beside her without speaking, took the rest of the sack and finished the job while she rubbed her hands together to keep the chill from settling in her knuckles. "I was thinking," she said, eyes on the horizon, "if we could get a few hens through the winter, maybe we could hatch some chicks come spring." Malden glanced toward the coop, its roof patched with tar paper and old tin. "We'd have to shore up the inside. Insulation's thin." "I can sew a lining," she said, "burlap stuffed with straw." He nodded. "We'll need more feed before the next snow. I'll make us a list." A crow cawed once from the bare cottonwood, and she tilted her head toward it. "You ever hear crows call before a storm? I've heard old hands swear by it. They're not wrong." He studied her face, the way her eyes narrowed slightly as she listened to the wind. "You always read signs like that?" "I had to learn. My mother said the land speaks first if you're willing to hush and listen." They stood quietly then, watching the sky pull pale blue over the far hills. A low hum of wind passed through the grass, and neither of them moved until the chickens began to fuss behind them. Inside, she pulled her ledger from the shelf, one sheet salvaged from the mercantile's cast-offs. The pages were yellowed, but the binding held. She dipped the pen in the ink pot and began jotting down not just feed, but salt, thread, and dried currants. Malden leaned over her shoulder, reading the list without speaking until she paused. "You ever think about expanding the herd?" she asked. He rested a hand on the back of her chair. "I did. Once. Before the fire. But not after. There wasn't much use in planning for a future I couldn't see." She set the pen down and turned to face him. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now I'm seeing farther than I ever did." She didn't smile, but something in her face eased. There's a man up in KC who sells young stock. I met his wife once. She'd trade for preserves. We'd need to haul them ourselves, Malden said. Wagon sound, but the left axle creaks. Then we'll fix it. Together. The fire in the stove crackled low, and she set another log inside before standing. Before I came here, she said, I never knew what it felt like to make decisions without someone deciding for me first. You're not under anyone's hand now, he said. I know. That's why I want to stay. He stepped closer, close enough to feel her breath against his collarbone. I want to give you more than a place to stay. I don't want more land, she whispered. I want a life that feels like mine. He reached for her hand, rough against his own, and held it steady between them. Then let's build that life. Piece by piece. Later that day, they walked the edge of the property, marking where the fencing had sagged near the north slope. She pointed out where a second paddock might help, and he listened, not with habit, but with intent. Their boots left a trail in the frost-bitten grass, side by side, the sun glinting off the hills as it dipped toward the horizon. They returned to the house with the last of the light, Leora's cheeks flushed from the cold. She lit the lantern while Malden fed the stove, and the room bloomed warm again. As she folded a quilt across the foot of the bed, she looked over her shoulder. I never thought I'd feel safe in a place that wasn't mine. Malden leaned in the doorway, his hands at his sides. It is yours. Every corner you've touched feels like it remembers you. She turned to face him fully. Then I want to make a home here. With you. Not as guest, not as helper. As wife. His breath caught, not from surprise, but from the certainty in her voice. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, thumbs resting against the edge of her jaw. I've waited a long time to feel worthy of that word. Husband. His voice was steady. But I want it. With you. She didn't answer with words. She leaned into him and kissed him, slow and sure, like she'd already made that vow in her heart. Outside, the stars bloomed across the sky, and inside the house, two people who had once been discarded by the world began to shape something lasting not from grand promises or desperate need, but from the quiet, present choice to belong to one another. The snow came early that year, falling soft over the ridge and laying a hush across the valley. The night before it started, Malden had set the final beam into the smokehouse roof, and Liora had stacked the last of the dried herbs into the pantry. They hadn't spoken much that evening, but when he handed her his gloves on the porch and she slid her fingers into them, he covered her hands with his own and kissed her forehead without needing a reason. By the second week of December, the snow was knee-deep in the pasture, and the hens had stopped laying. Liora opened the stove each morning before dawn and baked flatbread with whatever they had, sometimes crushed cornmeal, sometimes the last of the rye. The two of them moved through the house like they shared a single rhythm, passing tools or folded linens without needing to speak. One night, as wind scraped across the eaves, she asked, "Did your mother teach you how to read?" He looked up from mending the old saddle cinch. "No. My brother taught me, slow as it went. We had one Bible and a pamphlet from a seed company. I got good at sounding out the Latin names for squash." She laughed softly, the sound warm in the quiet. "I had a teacher in Kansas who made me copy out sermons by hand. Said it would teach me patience. I think she just wanted silence. I'd like to see her handwriting sometime." She reached for the ledger and opened it to a blank page. The ink caught the firelight as she wrote his name in a careful, looping hand. Then she turned the book toward him. "I've been practicing," she said. "In case we ever need to write a letter with our names on it." He stared at the page, his name written like it belonged somewhere permanent. "You thinking of the preacher? If you are." He nodded once, the weight of it settling into his chest in a way that felt steady, not sudden. "I am." The next morning, he harnessed the mule and rode into town alone. When he returned near sundown, Liora met him at the gate, brushing flour from her apron. He handed her a folded paper, still warm from his coat. "Preacher says he'll come day after tomorrow. He'll bring the book and the words." She didn't answer right away, just unfolded the paper and traced the corner with her thumb. "I never thought I'd wear white again." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't have to wear anything but yourself. That's all I want." 2 days later, the preacher arrived in a borrowed sleigh, boots dusted with salt and a smile that crinkled his eyes. Liora had braided her hair and tied it with a strip of muslin the same shade as the morning frost. Malden wore his cleanest shirt, the one that still held the scent of cedar from the chest where he kept it. They stood in the parlor, hands joined, with the fire snapping behind them. The preacher spoke simple words, and they repeated them without falter. When he said, "You may seal it as you choose," Malden brushed a kiss to her lips, and she leaned into it with both hands gripping his. After the sleigh tracks had faded from the snow, Malden and Liora sat together beside the fire, the hush of new vows settling around them like a quilt. She rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I never felt my name fit until today." He kissed her hair. "It fits you just fine now." In the weeks that followed, the storms came harder, but the house held. Liora taught him how to thicken milk with vinegar for baking. He carved her a comb from pine and rubbed it smooth with beeswax. They hung bundles of dried apple from the rafters and made a cradle from scrap wood, though no child had yet been promised between them. It was her idea, and he had said nothing, only built it as she watched from the doorway. "We lost so much before," she said one night, running her fingers along the cradle's edge. "It's good to make room." He reached for her hand and folded it into his. "Whatever comes, we'll hold it together." By the end of February, the days began to stretch again. Sunlight lingered longer on the porch rail, and the hens began their slow return to laying. Liora planted parsley and onion seed in wooden boxes near the window, and Malden fixed the bee-skep that had cracked in the cold. One morning, she stood at the table with both hands pressed flat on the wood, her brow furrowed. "You all right?" he asked, coming up beside her. She turned to him slowly. "I'm late." His breath caught, but he didn't speak. "I wasn't sure at first," she said. "But now I am." He reached out and took her hands from the table. "You want this?" "I want anything that comes from us." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her slowly, reverently. "Then we'll make room." Spring came early, and with it, a softness to the land they hadn't seen in years. The trees budded quick, and the creek behind the barn swelled with meltwater. Malden built a bench for Liora beneath the cottonwood, where she liked to rest in the afternoons with her hands folded over her growing belly. They spent their days preparing, not with fear, but care. She stitched tiny shirts from rough linen and lined a basket with wool scraps. He reinforced the roof beams and replaced the latch on the front door, wanting the house to be sound in every way. When the child arrived in late summer, a girl with Liora's eyes and Malden's quiet mouth, they named her Wren, for the way her cries sounded like song. Liora held her close that first night, rocking slow by the fire. Malden sat beside them, one hand on Liora's knee, the other brushing the downy curve of Wren's head. "Never thought I'd have this," he murmured. Liora looked at him, her eyes full and certain. "It's ours. All of it." The land outside their window kept its silence, but it held them now, not as ghosts or wanderers, but as something rooted. Malden and Liora O'Dale, joined not by rescue or need, but by choice, by building, by the long, slow work of trust. And inside that quiet house, beneath the same worn roof, love remained not loud, not hurried, but steady as the seasons, and just as enduring.